There is a chapter of human history that does not merely lie forgotten. It was buried, deliberately, violently, and with a precision that suggests someone wanted the silence to last forever. Tonight, we do something audacious. We do not just revisit the ruins of the world's first civilization, we open a sealed tomb of memory itself. And we follow the seams of clay and myth until they crack open under the weight of questions too old, too large, and too dangerous to ignore. Because if the story you are about to hear is true, if even a fraction of it is true, then the origins of civilization, of kingship, of religion, and perhaps of humanity itself must be rebuilt from the ground up. And the first brick in that reconstruction lies not in Egypt, not in Greece, but in an ancient land between two rivers, Sumer. The earliest storytellers of humanity claimed that their kings descended from the heavens, that power fell from the sky like a stone that could not be lifted by mortal hands. They recorded this lineage on clay, in a writing system that predates alphabet and ink. They engraved their world into the earth itself. But throughout time, those records fractured. Some were burned, some were shattered, some were simply ignored, dismissed as fantasies of a primitive people who dreamed too big. And yet, here is the unsettling truth. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more these fantasies look like the memory of something real, preserved in metaphor and myth, but anchored by artifacts that refuse to be quiet. This is the beginning of a 91-minute journey, a descent through text, stone, fire, and flood. We will trace a line from the world's first cities to the world's oldest epic, from the rise of Gilgamesh to the moment the sky itself turned against humanity, from the speculations of modern fringe theorists to the hard geological scars of global catastrophe. If we follow that line to the end, we might find that history is not a slow climb, but a cycle of ascent, destruction, and rebirth. But before we enter the labyrinth, before we decipher the clay testimonies left by the ancients, we must confront a question so vast it casts a shadow across everything that follows. If history can be erased once, what prevents it from being erased again? Let us begin at the only place where truth can survive millennia, the written record. And yet, even that record is shaken. The civilization of Sumer appears abruptly in the archaeological timeline, as if ignited rather than grown. Here, around 5,000 years ago, writing emerges in a form already complex. Here, administration and accounting bloom not gradually, but abruptly, like a system imported rather than invented. Here, monumental architecture rises in a style that seems strangely mature for a culture so close to the dawn of recorded time. If our timeline of human development were a ladder, Sumer looks like a skip of several rungs. But the Sumerians themselves left a clue that scholars have wrestled with for over a century. They wrote that before the kings of their cities reigned in the flesh, another lineage held power. A lineage they did not call mythic, but historical. They spoke of beings who governed the destinies of mankind long before the first city wall was raised. They called them the Anunnaki. We will return to them. For now, hold the name in your mind like a spark waiting for oxygen. Sumer's own answer to the question of origins is preserved on what might be the most provocative document of the ancient world, the Sumerian King List. A document that mixes reigns lasting mere decades with reigns lasting 30,000 years. A document that places Gilgamesh, the hero of the world's first epic, not in the realm of pure story, but squarely among the rulers of flesh and bone. But before we get there, before we hold that tablet up to the light, we need to understand the stage on which this history was written. And that stage is the land itself. Sumer was not a mythic otherworld. It was real Earth. Floodplains, riverbanks, and mud brick rising from the hot Mesopotamian plain. But what was built on that plain was unlike anything before it. Cities that dwarfed their neighbors. Administrative systems that seemed too polished for their age. A level of complexity that should have taken centuries to evolve, yet appears to have erupted almost overnight. Why? That is the first fracture in the silence of history. A fracture that invites speculation, but also demands discipline. Because for every fringe theory that tries to explain Sumer as the legacy of extraterrestrial engineers, there is a body of archaeological evidence that tells a more grounded, yet equally astonishing story. A story of innovation, of crisis, of ambition, and perhaps of memory carried from an older world. Tonight, we walk the line between these two explanations, the fantastic and the factual. Not to collapse them into one, but to examine where they touch. So let us begin where all civilizations begin, with the human need to record, to preserve, to resist the eroding hand of time. Imagine a world with no alphabet, no parchment, no digital archive. A world where memory must be pressed by hand into wet clay with a reed stylus. Every mark a decision, every tablet a defiance of oblivion. In such a world, only the most essential truths are carved. Only the most consequential events survive the furnace. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered the great libraries of Mesopotamia, Nineveh, Sippar, Uruk, they did not expect to find tens of thousands of clay tablets, hardened into ceramic by the fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them. Destruction had become preservation, a paradox as old as civilization. And among those tablets lay texts that would change the world. Legal codes, hymns, letters, astronomical notes, incantations, administrative receipts, and epics. Stories so old they predate Homer by more than 1,000 years. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand the power of clay. A clay tablet is not fragile. It is eternal. Iron rusts, wood rots, papyrus crumbles. But clay, once fired, endures. The ancient Sumerians did not know this scientific principle, but they knew, somehow, that to inscribe truth into clay was an act of defiance against death itself. And so, across the riverbanks of Sumer, clay was shaped into memory. Some memories were practical, some sacred, some political, some mythic. But all were part of a tapestry that, when assembled, gives us the most complete picture of any Bronze Age civilization. Yet even that tapestry has holes, some intentional, some accidental, some still unexplained. As we move forward, you will see that the distance between myth and history is narrower in Sumer than anywhere else. In this land, gods walked among kings. Kings borrowed the authority of gods, and the boundary between the mortal and the divine was a river easily crossed. A dangerous idea, one that could be used to legitimize power, or to rewrite the past in the image of those who ruled. Which returns us to the question we began with. If history can be rewritten, what was written first? If memory can be shaped, who shaped it? Now, before we dive deeper, take a breath, because the next hour will unfold not as a single narrative, but as a series of layers. Layers of clay, of ruins, of scientific evidence, and of forgotten voices, each one supporting the next, each one revealing a version of our origin story that is stranger, older, and more human than we imagine. We begin with texts, we move to cities, we pass through myth, we collide with catastrophe, and then we emerge at a hypothesis that has haunted archaeology for decades, that civilization did not begin once, but restarted. But do not accept anything yet. Let the evidence speak for itself. Tonight, our task is not to believe, it is to see. So ask yourself, even now, before we lift the first tablet from the dust, if an earlier chapter of humanity existed, if an entire civilization once rose and fell before the dawn of recorded history, what would its survivors have carried into the next age? What tools, what stories, what warnings, and what ruins, if any, might remain? These are not idle questions. They are the compass of this journey. As we step into the first chamber of our investigation, remember this. Every civilization writes two histories, one that it intends the future to read, and one that it cannot help leaving behind, in ruins, in strata, in mythic echoes scattered across cultures that never met. Our mission, in this first chapter, is to learn how to read both. Now, if you're with me, if your curiosity is awake, if your doubts are sharpened, if your sense of wonder is intact, then let us open the first door. Because the story of who we are begins long before the first city rose from the dust. And the people who lived before the flood, the people whose world collapsed into myth, left us something extraordinary. A record, a testimony, a warning. And that is where we go next. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and whether you think history is a straight line, or a loop waiting to be rediscovered. Prepare yourself. The tablets are waiting. If the first crack in the silence of ancient history is the sudden appearance of Sumer, then the second, and far deeper, fracture is a single clay document that should not exist, yet does. A document so bold, so impossible, and so strangely matter-of-fact that scholars still argue not just about what it means, but about why it was written at all. This artifact is known as the Sumerian King List, a record that blends the mundane with the supernatural, the plausible with the unthinkable, and the historical with the mythic, all on the same continuous line of kingship. It reads not as fiction, not as poetry, but as a dry, bureaucratic chronicle. And that, paradoxically, is what makes it disturbing. It is one thing for mythology to claim gods ruled the earth. It is another for a scribe to inscribe it as administrative fact. Let us approach this document carefully, not as believers, not as skeptics, but as investigators, reading the testimony of a civilization that saw no contradiction in writing the miraculous into the margins of the real. The tablets that contain the king list were not all found in a single location or a single version. They appear across different Sumerian cities, in Kish, in Larsa, in Nippur, each with slight variations, but all sharing the same core spine, an unbroken chain of rulers stretching from before the Great Flood to the early dynasties of Sumer. The list begins not with a city, but with a declaration. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. 6 words that collapse the distance between myth and administration. 6 words that anchor divine authority onto a specific place and time. To the Sumerians, this was not metaphor. It was the origin point of order itself. The early rulers named on the list are said to have reigned not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Lifespans that stretch far beyond human biology. Lifespans that, if taken literally, would redefine what kind of beings these early kings were. Lifespans that, if taken symbolically, still raise the question: why encode mythic durations into a document meant to legitimize human rulers? Some scholars argue that these immense numbers represent lunar cycles or ritual calendars rather than literal years. Others believe they express cosmological significance. Some propose they served purely propagandistic functions, connecting living kings to a golden age so distant it might as well have been eternity. But here is the problem. None of these explanations fully fit. The list is too clean, too structured, too deliberate to be dismissed as poetic exaggeration. And its transitions are too precise. Because once the flood occurs, an event the Sumerians considered a historical watershed, the rain lengths suddenly drop into realistic ranges. It is as if the world before and the world after the flood belonged to two different species. And then, in the post-flood section, something remarkable happens. A name appears that we know from another source entirely. A name that reverberates across literature, archaeology, and legend. Gilgamesh. On the king list, he is not introduced as a hero, not as a demigod, not as a character of mythic imagination. He is presented as a king among kings, with a reign length of 126 years. Still extraordinary, but no longer impossible. Still larger than life, but now tethered to the chronology of real cities and real rulers. This is the first collision point between story and history, a point where two narratives that should never meet align perfectly on the clay. But the king list is only the beginning. Its existence invites questions that reach beyond itself. Because the list does not merely record rulers, it records transfers of power. Kingship was in Eridu, then kingship was carried to Bad Tabira, then to Larak, then to Sippar. As though kingship were a literal object, a crown of divine authority passed from city to city across the ages. This idea, that kingship itself descended from a higher realm and moved according to some cosmic plan, was foundational to Sumerian political theology. But it also serves another function, subtler and more strategic. It legitimizes whoever holds it. Every new dynasty could point to this lineage and say, "We stand in the same line that began before the flood." The king list is not merely a record. It is a legal argument carved in clay. It is propaganda that has fossilized into history. And yet, even as propaganda, it tells us something profound. The Sumerians believed they inherited something that began before them. Something that did not originate in human hands. Now, in any other civilization, we could dismiss this as priestly invention. But in Sumer, where writing, urban planning, administration, and monumental architecture appear with uncanny suddenness, the claim feels less like arrogance and more like memory. But there is another document, smaller, more obscure, less dramatic, yet somehow even more important. A document that anchors the king list into the soil of reality. It is known as the Tumal inscription. On its face, it is simple, a construction record, the kind of bureaucratic text that normally puts archaeologists to sleep. It lists kings who contributed to the building of a temple in the sacred city of Nippur. But among its lines, quietly, almost shyly, appear two names, Gilgamesh and his son Ur-Nungal. Not as legends, not as heroes, as builders. If the king list opens the door, the Tumal inscription steps through it. It verifies that someone bearing the name Gilgamesh was remembered as a historical figure, tied to a specific project in a specific city, in a text that has no mythological agenda. This is the kind of corroboration historians pray for, because myths can drift, epics can evolve, oral traditions can exaggerate, but construction records rarely lie. Still, some will argue that names alone prove nothing, that Gilgamesh may have been a common name or a title, that stories could have been retrofitted around a historical kernel. But this misses the larger point. Sumerian scribes did not separate myth from history the way we do. Their kings were expected to stride between both worlds. Their gods were expected to intervene in daily life. Their epics were expected to reflect real political institutions, even when embellished. The king list and the Tumal inscription are two halves of a single truth. In Sumer, memory was layered. Human deeds and cosmic narratives coexisted without contradiction. To understand why this matters, imagine a world where the past is not a linear timeline, but a spiral, where the same motifs, the same catastrophes, the same structures of power return again and again across ages. In such a world, myth is not fiction, it is coded history. It is the memory of a civilization that lived through Cataclysm and survived by turning memory into story. The question is not whether the king list is literal or symbolic. The question is what compelled the Sumerians to write it the way they did. Why encode divine kings with superhuman lifespans? Why emphasize a descent of kingship from the heavens? Why establish a pre-flood world so structured, so detailed, so administratively coherent? These choices do not sound like mythology. They sound like recollection. Let us go deeper. The creation of the king list coincides with a period of intense political centralization. Sumer was a patchwork of independent city-states, each ruled by its own king, each competing for influence, resources, and divine favor. A unified narrative, one that justified the current rulers, was a powerful weapon. The king list provided that weapon. If you could trace your lineage back to the first kings, if you could claim continuity from a time when gods walked the earth, you held authority that transcended mere force. Your enemies did not just challenge you, they challenged the cosmic order itself. But the list also reveals profound anxiety, a fear of fragmentation, a fear of forgetting, a fear that without a coherent narrative, the past would dissolve into chaos. This makes the king list more than propaganda. It makes it an act of preservation, an attempt to stitch together every fragment of memory, mythical or historical, into one unbroken story. But every stitch tells us something else. The Sumerians believed the flood was real, not metaphorical, not allegorical. Real. They mark it as a dividing line in their chronology, a reset button on kingship, on society, on the world. This idea will become essential later in our journey, when we examine the geological evidence for an event that could have imprinted itself so deeply into the psyche of early humanity that it echoed across continents and millennia. But for now, stay with the texts, because clay does not lie. It may be misunderstood, it may be misinterpreted, but it does not lie. A scribe can manipulate content, but they cannot manipulate stratigraphy. They cannot manipulate the fact that tablets appear in contexts where they should not, or that certain types of writing emerge fully formed, without evolutionary precursors. And this brings us to the second major body of evidence: administrative tablets. On the surface, they seem dull. Lists of grain deliveries, inventories of livestock, names of workers, rations, debts, shipments, registries, the skeletal structure of early bureaucracy. But beneath that surface lies something extraordinary. These tablets represent the world's first data system, a civilization that understood that knowledge, counted, standardized, recorded, was power. The evolution from pictographs to cuneiform is not gradual. It is explosive. And the earliest tablets already reflect a sophistication that suggests the existence of earlier models. Yet archaeologists have not found those earlier stages. They appear to leap from silence into structure. When we place the king list beside these administrative records, a pattern emerges. The earliest Sumerian cities did not develop haphazardly. They followed templates. Their temples followed standardized forms. Their administrative systems followed formulas. Their storytelling traditions followed structures that seemed too polished for a first attempt. It is as if the Sumerians were not inventing civilization, but restoring it. Think of a survivor of a collapsed world. Someone who remembers fragments of lost knowledge. Someone who rebuilds with whatever tools they can salvage. The result is a culture that looks both new and ancient, both innovative and derivative, both original and inherited. This is what Sumer feels like, a beginning that resembles a return. And if that is true, if Sumer was the reboot of a forgotten past, then texts like the King List are not fantasies. They are echoes. They are the memory of a world that existed before the flood, carried through catastrophe by survivors who encoded their knowledge into myth, ritual, and clay. We must ask then, where did their memory come from? What histories did they inherit? What ruins did they see? What stories did they hear from those who outlived a world older than ours? These are not fringe questions. They are invitations to rethink what the earliest texts are telling us. The King List does not ask to be believed. It asks to be understood. Its message is simple. Before us, there was something powerful, something organized, something lost. And it is here, standing at the threshold of myth, history, and memory, that we prepare to enter the next chamber of our investigation, the physical world the Sumerians built, the city that became the blueprint for every city that followed, Uruk. But before we walk its walls, before we read the stones, consider this final question. If the first writing of humanity insists that our story began before the flood, what does that say about us? About our origins? About the chapters missing from our timeline? Hold that thought, because what comes next is not just a city, it is a revelation. Before we talk about gods or epics or catastrophes, we must confront something far more stubborn and far more revealing: the stones. Because myths can bend, texts can exaggerate, but a city, an entire city, cannot lie. It may erode, crumble, collapse, or sink beneath the soil, but it cannot pretend to be something it is not. And that is precisely the problem with Uruk. It is too large, too advanced, too sudden. It stands at the dawn of civilization, like a fully grown titan stepping out of the shadows, with no clear childhood, no evolutionary ramp-up, and no plausible explanation for how it came to exist when and where it did. To understand why Uruk is the hinge of this entire investigation, we must first understand what it was. Not romantically, not mythically, but structurally. Uruk, around 3200 BCE, was the largest city on Earth. Let that sentence settle. At a time when most humans lived in small villages or in tribal communities scattered across river valleys, Uruk sprawled across 6 square kilometers. Its population, conservatively estimated at 50 to 80,000 people, rivaled the later capitals of the classical world. Its economy was not just organized, it was systematic. Its temples were not mere places of worship. They were engines of administration, manufacturing, and redistribution. Its scribes were not storytellers. They were accountants, managers, archivists, and bureaucratic architects. Uruk was not an accident. It was a plan. And that is what disturbs historians most. Because planned cities require something more than labor. They require foresight. They require models. They require a blueprint. And nowhere in the region's earlier archaeological record is such a blueprint visible. Let us walk the city as it once stood. Imagine approaching its walls, a defensive ring almost 10 kilometers long, fortified by nearly 900 semicircular towers. The bricks are kiln-fired, not sun-dried, meaning that a staggering amount of fuel was burned merely to produce the raw material. This is not the work of a small community. This is the work of a centralized state with supply chains, resource allocation, and leadership capable of motivating thousands of workers. Who was that leader? And where did his authority come from? The Sumerians themselves provide an answer: Gilgamesh. But we will return to him later. First, we need to understand how Uruk functioned. Inside the walls, the city was divided into precincts, each dominated by monumental temples. The Eanna district was dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war. It was a sprawling religious campus with courtyards, workshops, shrines, storage facilities, and administrative rooms. The mosaics, thousands of small clay cones pressed into walls to form patterns, suggest not just labor, but aesthetic sophistication, the kind of decorative culture that normally emerges much later. Nearby was the Anu ziggurat, a massive platform topped by the White Temple. From its summit, priests looked out over the entire plain, asserting the presence of divine authority at the literal and symbolic highest point of the city. And between these temple districts ran streets, neighborhoods, markets, kilns, breweries, storehouses, and dwellings. An urban ecosystem humming with life, governed by rules, roles, and rituals. But the most extraordinary evidence for Uruk's complexity is not found in its monuments. It is found in its trash. Tens of thousands of beveled rim bowls, crude, uniform clay vessels have been discovered throughout the city. Their sheer volume suggests something revolutionary: mass production. These bowls appear to have been standardized ration containers, not purchased, issued. This implies a labor force that was centrally managed and compensated by the state, possibly the world's first salaried workforce. Their wages were food, beer, and bread. Their hours were tracked by scribes. Their output was regulated. This was not early civilization. This was bureaucracy. The bowls are the receipts of an economic machine. But here is the puzzle. None of this should exist at this early stage of human history. Before Uruk, no city even approaches this scale. No writing system approaches this complexity. No administrative apparatus approaches this sophistication. It is not just that Uruk is advanced. It is advanced too early. Let us address the mainstream position first. Archaeologists argue that Uruk represents the culmination of a long developmental process. That villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and cities grew into Uruk. But this narrative strains under the evidence. The supposed ladder of development beneath Uruk is missing rungs. In many regions, entire centuries are blank, or filled with settlements far too primitive to serve as predecessors to a metropolis of this caliber. Evidence for gradual development is thin. Evidence for sudden emergence is overwhelming. So how do we explain it? There are three broad possibilities. Possibility 1. Uruk was an extraordinary outlier. A coincidence of geography, ecology, human ingenuity, and social organization so rare that it accelerated beyond all contemporaries. This is the conventional view, but it does not answer the deeper question. Why here? Why then? Why so quickly? Possibility 2. Uruk was the inheritor of a lost developmental pipeline, a transfer of knowledge from a precursor culture whose remains have not survived, perhaps because they were built in organic materials or located along coastlines now submerged by post-Ice Age sea level rise. This is a controversial view, but it aligns with patterns seen in other regions. Possibility 3. Uruk is the reboot of a civilizational memory, a reconstruction by survivors of an earlier age who retained fragments of knowledge, stories, architectural principles, and administrative structures. Not a perfect transmission, but a partial one, a reassembly. This is the mythic view. But mythology, in Sumer, behaves suspiciously like history. The Sumerians claimed that before their dynasties, before their cities, and before the flood, another world existed. They said its rulers were not human. They said knowledge descended from heaven. They said their institutions were inherited, not invented. Modern scholars dismiss this as ideological propaganda, but the archaeological record does not support an easy dismissal. There is no clear evolutionary sequence. There is no slow climb. There is a cliff, and Uruk sits on top of it. If the Sumerians were reconstructing something, even imperfectly, their sudden sophistication makes sense. It explains the immediate jump to large-scale architecture. It explains the standardized administrative system. It explains the writing system that appears already highly functional. It explains why their earliest myths describe gods bringing civilization as something already complete. But let us set aside speculation for a moment and return to hard evidence. Uruk was not static. It expanded, contracted, reconfigured, and persisted for over 3,000 years. In its early phases, the city was dense, energetic, experimental. In its later phases, it became more organized and more monumental. Throughout all phases, it retained the same symbolic centers, the Iana and the Anu precincts. This continuity is striking. Civilizations rise and fall, capitals shift, temples are replaced. But Uruk's sacred geography endured across millennia, as if following a template. Even stranger, the earliest monumental buildings of Uruk replicate architectural motifs that appear suddenly, with no prototypical forms beneath them. Pillared halls, mosaic facades, terraced platforms. These are not experiments, they are fully realized. The question is no longer, why is Uruk advanced? The question is, where did Uruk's template come from? Now, some might argue that innovation can occur spontaneously. that human creativity, given the right environment, can leap forward unpredictably. And this is true, to an extent. But innovation leaves traces. Trial and error leaves archaeological fingerprints. Failed prototypes leave ruins. Uruk does not show this. It shows execution, not experimentation. So let us consider what the Sumerians themselves would say. They claimed that kingship descended from the heavens. They claimed that their institutions were gifts. They claimed that before the flood, before the cities we know, another world existed. This does not mean extraterrestrial engineers, but it does mean that the Sumerians believed they were inheriting, not inventing. And if we treat their claim not as a literal descent of gods, but as the memory of an earlier, forgotten culture, a culture destroyed by catastrophe, then Uruk begins to make sense. The Sumerians were rebuilding a world they partially remembered. Imagine survivors of a technological civilization who find themselves in a ruined landscape. They remember agriculture, but not metallurgy. They remember administration, but not the mathematics that made it efficient. They remember stories of their ancestors, but not the science behind those stories. Over generations, these memories harden into myth. When they rebuild from memory. That is the hypothesis that haunts the stones of Uruk. But even without this speculative frame, the physical reality of Uruk challenges our understanding of human development. It is not a city at the beginning of civilization. It is civilization already hitting stride. Now, let us introduce a critical player in this mystery: writing. Writing did not evolve slowly in Sumer. The earliest tablets show a system already tailored for complex administration. Pictographs representing commodities, measurements, workers, quantities, and transactions appear suddenly. And the jump from pictographs to cuneiform occurs swiftly, not over thousands of years, but over centuries. This is not normal, and yet it happened. Why? Because Uruk needed writing. Its administrative complexity demanded it, and writing appears precisely where and when that complexity peaks. It is as if writing was created to manage the scale of Uruk, rather than Uruk growing gradually thanks to the presence of writing. This inversion is significant. Technology usually drives complexity. In Uruk, complexity seems to have driven technology. This suggests that the social structures of Uruk preceded their written documentation. But how could such structures form without writing, without records, without templates? This returns us to the paradox. Everything in Uruk feels like a continuation, not a beginning. Now, let us confront the most striking evidence of all: absence. Archaeologists have never found a proto-Uruk. No precursor city, no smaller, earlier version, no training ground. Uruk appears like a light switching on in the darkness, which brings us to the final question of this chapter. If Uruk is a beginning without a past, then what happened to the past it should have had? Why is it missing? Why is it silent? Why is it erased? In the next chapter, we will meet the figure who stands at the center of this enigma, the king whose story anchors literature, archaeology, politics, and myth. A man half divine, half mortal. A man whose name is stamped onto tablets, seals, and legends. A man whose presence in Uruk is so powerful that his shadow stretches 4,000 years into the future. Gilgamesh. But to understand him, we must understand the city he ruled. And now you have seen it, not as ruins, but as a living world. Hold the image of Uruk in your mind, because everything that follows, every story, every epic, every catastrophe, spirals back to its walls. and the man who walked atop them. Before we can unlock the mysteries of ancient catastrophe or decipher the testimonies written in clay, we must confront the man whose story haunts every corridor of early civilization. A king whose shadow stretches from the temples of Uruk to the far edges of myth. A ruler who was remembered not simply as a conqueror, but as a force of nature. Terrifying, brilliant, relentless. His name is Gilgamesh. But the story you think you know is not the story the ancients told. To understand him, you must forget everything modern storytelling has taught you about heroes. Gilgamesh is not noble. He is not gentle. He is not wise. Not at first. His greatness is not in his virtue, but in his evolution. He begins as a tyrant. And that, paradoxically, is what makes him the most human character in the earliest literature of the world. According to the Sumerian texts, Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a ratio that reveals everything about the psychology of this man. His divine portion granted him strength beyond measure, beauty that terrified, and knowledge that bordered on the supernatural. But that 1/3 mortal part, the fraction of him that could die, was an anchor of dread, a flaw, a curse, the seed of every fear that would eventually consume him. Imagine possessing power that no one can challenge, yet knowing that death will still take you. Imagine being closer to a god than any mortal, yet fated to meet the same end as a shepherd, a potter, a common laborer. To the Sumerians, this was not metaphor. It was a diagnosis. Gilgamesh's tyranny was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the rage of a being too powerful to be human, too mortal to be divine. The texts say, "He leaves no son to his father, and no maiden to her lover." A king who worked his people to exhaustion. A man so restless that his very presence warped the rhythms of the city. Uruk, under his rule, was alive, but it trembled. The people cried out to the gods for relief, and the gods answered in a way that reveals an insight deeper than any psychological treatise. They created a counterweight. Enkidu, not from heaven, but from clay. Not in the palace, but in the wilderness. Not polished, but raw. If Gilgamesh was the pinnacle of civilization, refined, powerful, dangerous, then Enkidu was its opposite. Wild, innocent, untamed. He lived among animals. He ran with gazelles. He drank from streams. His strength matched Gilgamesh's, but his heart lacked ambition. He did not know cities. He did not know power. He did not know fear. He was the perfect rival. But here is where the story turns from political allegory to something far more profound. Enkidu's transformation from beast to man begins not with violence, but with seduction. Through the priestess Shamhat, he learns the rituals of humanity: food, clothing, companionship, language. In the Sumerian worldview, civilization begins not with architecture or administration, but with intimacy, with social connection, with the rituals that bind humans together. When Enkidu enters Uruk, he challenges Gilgamesh. Two titans collide. A wrestling match shakes the very doorposts of the city. Walls tremble, stones crack, crowds scream, but neither gains victory. The moment they exhaust themselves, something unprecedented happens. They embrace. This moment, two beings of equal strength recognizing each other, is the axis upon which the entire epic turns. The greatest king in the world is transformed not by war, not by conquest, but by the presence of someone who can finally stand on the same ground. Out of rivalry, friendship is born. Out of equality, humility begins. Out of challenge, humanity awakens. The ancient scribes were not simply writing a story, they were diagnosing the soul of leadership. Power without companionship becomes tyranny. Ambition without empathy becomes ruin. Gilgamesh's transformation begins not through punishment, but through relationship. Together, the two men embark on adventures meant to quell the restlessness in Gilgamesh's heart. They become brothers, mirrors, catalysts. Their first great quest takes them to the cedar forest, realm of the monstrous guardian Humbaba. And here, another layer of the epic emerges, one that resonates deeply with our investigation into ancient civilizations. The cedar forest was not simply a forest. It was a symbol of the old world, the world before cities, before kings, before the rising of the first brick walls. Humbaba was not simply a monster. He was the embodiment of nature's ancient power, a remnant of a time before human dominion. To defeat him was to assert civilization's ascendancy over the wild. But victory comes at a cost. The gods are angered not by the violence itself, but by what it symbolizes. The trespassing of human ambition into realms once reserved for forces older than mankind. The killing of the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar after Gilgamesh rejects her advances, pushes the boundary even further. The divine council meets. A decision is made. Not both heroes will pay, only one. And so the gods choose Enkidu, because Gilgamesh must learn something only death can teach. The death of Enkidu is not a heroic death. It is slow. It is humiliating. It is devastating. A wasting illness consumes him. His strength fades. His body betrays him. He dreams of the underworld. He curses the day he became human. He laments the loss of his wild innocence. Gilgamesh watches helplessly. This is the breaking point, the moment that fractures the king's arrogance forever. For the first time, Gilgamesh faces the truth he had spent his life outrunning. If Enkidu can die, he can die. And this realization drives him into madness. He wanders the wilderness wearing skins, hair uncut, eyes hollow, driven only by one question: how can I escape death? This is where Gilgamesh ceases to be a king and becomes a symbol. His quest is no longer political. It is existential. He seeks out the only man said to have survived the Great Flood, the man granted eternal life, Utnapishtim. To reach him, Gilgamesh must travel through mythic geography, the mountains where the sun enters and exits the world, the 12 leagues of total darkness, the jeweled garden where trees bear precious stones instead of fruit. These landscapes are not meant to be literal. They are the mapping of a psychological journey, a descent into the subconscious, a confrontation with fear, a symbolic death and rebirth. When Gilgamesh finally meets Utnapishtim, he does not find a glorious immortal. He finds an ordinary man, old, weathered, quiet. And this, too, is intentional. Immortality, in the ancient worldview, is not grandeur. It is survival. Utnapishtim tells his story, the story of the flood, the divine decision to erase humanity, the secret warning whispered by a sympathetic god, the construction of a colossal vessel, the annihilation of all life, and the eventual resting of the boat on a mountain peak. Gilgamesh listens, but he does not understand. He believes immortality is a reward. Utnapishtim tells him it was an accident. He believes immortality can be earned. Utnapishtim shows him it cannot. He believes he is different. Utnapishtim proves he is not. To demonstrate Gilgamesh's unfitness for eternal life, Utnapishtim gives him a simple task. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh cannot. He falls asleep almost instantly, and while he sleeps, Utnapishtim's wife bakes a loaf of bread for each day. When Gilgamesh awakens, the loaves show the passage of time. He has failed. Not in battle, not in courage, in something far more intimate: endurance. This is the heart of the epic. Sleep is the brother of death. If Gilgamesh cannot conquer sleep, he cannot conquer death. And yet, the story gives him one last chance. A plant from the bottom of the cosmic ocean, capable of restoring youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it, and for a moment, hope returns. But on his journey back to Uruk, he stops to bathe. A serpent emerges. It steals the plant. It sheds its skin. It is reborn. The message is brutal. Nature, not humanity, receives the gift of renewal. Gilgamesh weeps. He has lost everything. The quest is a failure. But then something extraordinary happens. As he returns to Uruk, he sees the walls he once built with tyrannical pride. The walls that have stood through storms, wars, and generations. Walls that will outlive him. And he understands, finally, the only immortality a human can grasp. Legacy. Not in divine blood, not in eternal life, but in what one builds. The epic ends with a quiet, devastating truth. We die. Our works do not. Gilgamesh's transformation, from tyrant to friend to mourner to seeker to humbled king, is not just the first character arc in human literature. It is the first psychological biography. It is the first exploration of grief, fear, identity, and mortality ever recorded. But more than that, much more. It is the outer layer of something deeper. Because behind Gilgamesh's personal journey lies a second narrative, older and stranger. A memory of a world destroyed. A memory of a flood that reset civilization. A memory that appears not only in Sumer, but across continents that never met. The flood narrative is not merely theological. It is historical, at least in the minds of the ancients. And the fact that the man who survived it appears in the same textual universe as the earliest cities, the earliest kings, and the earliest writing suggests something earth-shaking. The Sumerians did not view themselves as the first civilization. They viewed themselves as the successors. Gilgamesh's quest is not just a personal saga. It is a window into the deep memory of humanity. A memory of catastrophe, survival, and rebirth. And if we follow that memory to its source, we arrive at a moment when the sky may indeed have burned. The seas may indeed have risen, and the world may indeed have been reduced to silence before being built anew. But before we go there, stay with the story of Gilgamesh for one final moment. Because in his transformation, we find the emotional heartbeat of ancient Sumer. His arc mirrors the arc of a civilization rising from chaos, learning to govern itself, confronting the limits of its own power, and searching for meaning in a world shaped by forces far older and far more violent than humanity. The journey of Gilgamesh ends with acceptance. Our journey does not. Because now we must turn to the part of the story the ancients feared most. The part that blurs the boundary between literature and memory, between myth and trauma. the part where a flood does not symbolize transformation, but annihilation. Before we meet the man who survived it, we must understand the world that drowned. And that is where we go next. Before we follow the flood into its geological shadows, we must first witness it in the form that survived. The version the ancients themselves insisted was not metaphor, not allegory, but memory. A memory so old that it predates every surviving religion, every later chronicle, every nation that would rise from the ashes of the Bronze Age. The story comes to us through a single survivor, a man who should not exist, a man who broke the boundary between mortality and eternity. His name is Utnapishtim. He is the pivot upon which the Epic of Gilgamesh turns, not because he is glorious, but because he is ordinary. He is neither hero nor demigod. He has no supernatural strength. He performs no miracles. His one achievement is that he survived what no one else did. And that, in the eyes of the ancients, made him more important than any king. The Sumerians believed that the flood was not a local event. It was not a regional disaster. It was not a seasonal inundation amplified into legend. It was a total erasure, a cosmic reset, a deliberate act by divine forces who had grown tired of the noise of humanity, the chaos of civilization, the hubris of kings. According to the text, the gods gathered in council. Enlil, the stern adjudicator, initiated the plan. Erase the humans. Why? The ancient explanation is simple. They disturbed the gods with their clamor. But beneath this divine irritation lies a deeper theme, one we have seen before and will see again: the tension between creation and control. In Mesopotamian cosmology, humans were not noble beings crafted in a sacred image. They were workers, a labor force, an engineered species designed to maintain the world on behalf of beings who ruled from a higher tier of existence. When humanity became too numerous, too wild, too unpredictable, the gods sought to wipe the slate clean. And yet, one god dissented. Enki, also known as Ea, the trickster, the craftsman, the patron of knowledge and water. The same god associated with wisdom, cunning, and subtle rebellion. The same god who, in other myths, is responsible for giving humanity the me, the divine decrees that enable civilization itself. Enki could not openly defy the divine council, so he slipped around the rules. He visited Utnapishtim, but not directly. He spoke through the walls of the man's reed hut, a legal loophole, a cosmic technicality. Reed hut, wall, wall, listen. So begins the most consequential whisper in ancient literature. Enki instructs him to tear down his house, to build a vessel, to abandon his possessions, to save his family and the seed of all living creatures. Not an ark in the biblical sense. A cube, equal in length, width, and height. A mathematically perfect box of survival. Its purpose was not navigation. Its purpose was endurance. The text describes its construction with astonishing specificity. Dimensions, materials. Bitumen to make the hull watertight. Compartments for animals and grain. A roof sealed against the sky. This is not mythic language. It is architectural. Utnapishtim loads the vessel, his family, the craftsmen, the animals, his wealth, everything that can cross the threshold between worlds. And then the text shifts from instruction to terror. The storm begins. Not a rainstorm, not a river flood, a planetary convulsion. The gods unleash devastation so fierce that even the gods themselves were afraid. They retreat to the highest heavens, cowering. The world roars. Mountains shudder. The storm god Adad hammers the earth. The war god Ninurta drives destruction before him like a weaponized wind. For 6 days and 7 nights, the world is annihilated. The text describes a vision so violent, so global, so unrelenting that it cannot be mistaken for a seasonal disaster. The winds flatten all life. The waters rise above mountains. The horizon disappears. The land becomes an endless sheet of churning black water. When the storm breaks, an eerie silence hangs over the planet. Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out. He says, "All of humanity had turned to clay." That line, "turned to clay," is among the oldest descriptions of mass death ever written, and it appears not only in Mesopotamia, but in dozens of cultures across the world, describing the same moment. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nimush. He releases a dove. It returns. He releases a swallow. It returns. He releases a raven. It does not return. The flood is over. He offers a sacrifice. The gods, starved of offerings, gather around the smoke like flies. The language is visceral, undignified, almost accusatory. Enlil is furious that anyone survived. Enki confronts him. He argues for reason, for moderation, for balance. And in the aftermath of this argument, the gods grant Utnapishtim and his wife an extraordinary fate. Immortality. Not as a reward, but as a containment, a living reminder, a witness to the old world, preserved but exiled. They are taken to the mouth of the rivers, a distant, unreachable paradise, a liminal zone at the edge of the mapped world. This is where Gilgamesh finds him thousands of years later, desperate to escape the same fate that claimed Enkidu. And this is where the flood intersects with something far more troubling: science. Because for generations, scholars assumed the flood myth was symbolic, a metaphor for political upheaval or regional inundation. But that interpretation began to fracture in the 20th century. Then, in the 21st century, something astonishing happened. Geologists found evidence that around 12,800 years ago, long before writing, long before Sumer, long before agriculture, the Earth experienced a sudden, violent climatic reversal. A plunge into near-glacial conditions known as the Younger Dryas. It happened rapidly, within a decade. Then it lasted 1,200 years. Then it ended just as abruptly. This abrupt cooling is now widely believed to have been triggered by a cosmic impact event, likely fragments of a disintegrating comet that struck or exploded over ice sheets covering North America and parts of Europe. The evidence is not symbolic. It is physical. A thin black layer, found across 4 continents. Burnt material, charcoal, microscopic magnetic spherules, elevated platinum levels, nanodiamonds, created only under extreme heat and pressure. Beneath this black mat, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, alive. Above it, extinction. Beneath it, a flourishing Clovis culture of early humans. Above it, vanished. And across the world, cultures that emerged thousands of years later tell stories of a flood, of fire from the sky, of a world reset. The parallel is too large to ignore. The flood of Utnapishtim cannot simply be dismissed as fiction. It is the mythic encoding of a memory, an ancient trauma, processed through the language of gods and kings. But the question that haunts us is this: how did such a memory survive from the Ice Age to Sumer? Humanity had no writing then, no cities, no archives, no tablets. So how did survivors pass down a global story without a global culture? There are three possibilities. Possibility 1. Oral tradition. Trauma so immense that it is retold for thousands of years until writing captures it. Possibility 2. Multiple groups experienced regional versions of the same global catastrophe, creating independent narratives that later converged. Possibility 3. A remnant population. Small, isolated, but knowledgeable, preserved the memory deliberately and passed it into the early agricultural civilizations they helped shape. This is the most controversial possibility, but it aligns with the pattern we saw in Uruk, complexity emerging suddenly, as if inherited. If an advanced or semi-advanced Ice Age culture was obliterated by a cosmic cataclysm, its survivors, few in number, carrying fragments of knowledge, could have seeded the earliest river civilizations. To later generations, these survivors would appear as gods, sages, culture bringers. To the Sumerians, they became the Apkallu, semi-divine beings who taught humans agriculture, writing, architecture, kingship. To the Egyptians, they became Thoth and Osiris. To the Greeks, Atlas and Prometheus. To the Maya, Itzamna. To the Dogon, the Nomo. To India, the Rishis. To Polynesia, the luminous navigators. Every region has its teachers. Every teacher emerges after a flood. It is here, between myth and geology, between memory and ruin, that the story of Utnapishtim becomes more than a tale. It becomes a clue. The flood myth is a scar, cultural, emotional, planetary. And scars, unlike stories, are difficult to fabricate. But now we arrive at the most unsettling question. If a cosmic disaster erased an earlier epic of humanity, how much knowledge was lost? And how much, fragmented, distorted, mythologized, survived into the age of Sumer? This brings us back to Gilgamesh. His quest for immortality is not just the journey of a king. It is an echo of a species trying to remember what it once was and what it once survived. The fear that drove Gilgamesh into the wilderness is the same fear that drives civilizations to record, to build, to preserve. Because somewhere in our oldest stories lies the instinctive memory that the world has ended before and may end again. But before we follow that instinct deeper, before we step from myth into the geological violence preserved in ice, stone, and sediment, we must examine one more layer. Because the Sumerian flood story was not unique. There were others. Earlier. Stranger. More controversial. Stories of the Anunnaki. Stories of kings who ruled before the flood. Stories of knowledge descending from the sky. Stories that blend theology, astronomy, and something that looks disturbingly like technology. And these stories lead us to the next phase of our investigation: the identity of the beings who shaped the earliest civilizations, and what the ancients truly meant when they said, "The gods descended." The flood was the end of one world. The Anunnaki belonged to the world before it. And now, we step into theirs. If the flood was the end of an age, then the Anunnaki are the memory of the age before it. A memory preserved not as history, but as hierarchy. Because the Sumerians did not merely believe in gods, They believed in rulers. They believed in councils. They believed in cosmic administration. And most importantly, they believed that the order of the heavens was reflected in the order of kingship on earth. To understand them is to understand the ancient mind, how it processed catastrophe, how it preserved knowledge, how it justified authority, and how it explained the appearance of civilization almost overnight. But we must draw a clear boundary before we proceed. The Anunnaki of Sumer are not the same as the Anunnaki of modern conspiracy culture. The ancient texts describe them as a divine council, a celestial assembly, not as extraterrestrial minors, not as galactic warlords. Those versions emerged millennia later. Yet within the original myths lies something older, something deeper, something that feels as though it began as memory and fossilized into myth. So let us strip away the later reinterpretations and approach the Anunnaki as the Sumerians understood them. They were the princely offspring, those of royal seed, the high-born ones, a lineage of power older than the world of men. At the top of their hierarchy sat three figures, not gods in the abstract sense, but personalities, temperaments, forces. Anu, the remote patriarch, ruler of the highest heaven, the ultimate arbiter of cosmic order. Enlil, the enforcer, the executive, the god of wind and authority, feared for his severity. Enki, the trickster, the craftsman, the engineer of creation, whose sympathy for humanity repeatedly disrupts divine plans. These three form the triangle upon which Mesopotamian cosmology rests. But beneath them stands an entire pantheon, complex, fractious, contradictory. Here is where the story grows strange. Every culture creates gods, but not every culture records those gods acting like administrators. Not every culture describes gods distributing tasks. Not every culture portrays its deities debating population control. Not every culture envisions the divine realm as a near-perfect mirror of its own political world. The Anunnaki do. They argue over resources. They divide the earth into jurisdictions. They punish cities collectively. They reward kings selectively. They enforce laws, assign duties, and oversee the technologies that make civilization possible. In the myths, the me, the tablets of divine decrees, govern everything from kingship to weaving, from music to metallurgy. These are not metaphors for divine inspiration. They are portrayed as literal, transferable objects, data tablets in mythic form. In one myth, Inanna travels to Enki's abode, gets him drunk, and steals over 100 of these decrees. She loads them onto her boat and returns triumphant to Uruk. As a result, her city becomes the epicenter of civilization. This is political mythology with technological overtones. But it is also something else, a memory of knowledge being transferred, not invented. Now consider this. Sumerian myths do not merely describe the creation of humans. They describe the labor dispute that caused it. In the Atrahasis epic, the junior gods rebel against the senior ones. They are tired of digging canals, dredging rivers, and shaping the world. They want relief. And so the solution is proposed. Create a new species to do the work. Humanity is engineered from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a sacrificed deity, one who possessed intelligence. This gruesome detail is not theological flourish. It is functional. Intelligence is a substance passed through essence. Humans are created with intention, purpose, and a built-in dependency. We exist to serve. That is the worldview encoded into the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. But now we reach the critical question. Did the Sumerians invent this idea to justify their social hierarchy? Or did this mythology encode a memory of something older, something from before the flood? Because the Sumerians did not simply claim that the Anunnaki created humanity. They claimed that the earliest kings ruled because they were descended from them. Kingship descended from heaven. The earliest rulers had impossibly long reigns. Civilization was bestowed fully formed. To modern ears, these are myths. To ancient people, they were historical explanations. And here is where archaeology quietly agrees with the ancients, not literally, but structurally. Civilization does not appear in Sumer as a gradual ascent. It appears suddenly, with writing, monumental architecture, administration, astronomy, and social stratification emerging in a narrow window. The Sumerians said, "We did not invent these things. We inherited them." And archaeology responds, "There is little evidence of the slow development we expect. The Anunnaki may not have been real gods, but they represent something real, a memory of an earlier organizing force, an earlier system, an earlier world whose fragments seeded the new one." This brings us to a far more provocative point. The Anunnaki are tied, again and again, to the world before the flood. Their authority predates the deluge. Their decisions cause the deluge. Their survivors shape the world after the deluge. If we treat the flood not as myth, but as the memory of a Younger Dryas cataclysm, then the Anunnaki become the mythologized memory of the survivors, elites, or culture bearers of that older world. A civilization collapses. A handful survive. Their knowledge becomes myth. Their authority becomes divine. Their memory becomes the pantheon of the next age. This idea is controversial, but it explains the structure of the Sumerian worldview with uncanny precision. Now let us address the modern reinterpretations, because they matter, not as truth, but as psychological clues. In the 20th century, Zecharia Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a wandering planet. Modern scholars reject his translations, his astronomy, and his conclusions. But his popularity reveals a cultural hunger for an explanation that fits the data. The sudden emergence of civilization, the technological metaphors in the myths, the global recurrence of flood narratives, the eerie overlap between mythic kings and archaeological kings. People sense that something is missing in the official narrative, and they are right. But Sitchin's explanation is not the missing piece. The missing piece is something far more grounded and far more unsettling. Civilization did not begin once. It began twice. The first time, it ended. The second time, it remembered. The Anunnaki, then, are not aliens. They are the memories of the first time. Now let us examine their behavior in the epics themselves, because myth reveals character, and character reveals origin. The Anunnaki are not omniscient. They make mistakes. They panic. They regret decisions. They argue. They contradict one another. These are not the actions of gods beyond comprehension. These are the actions of a hierarchical elite, projected into the heavens. When Enlil floods the world, the gods flee, terrified. When humanity is wiped out, they cry, hungry, desperate, shocked. These are not metaphysical beings. These are rulers facing consequences they did not foresee. Their emotions are too human to be divine fiction. They are divine memory. But here is the strangest detail of all. The Anunnaki are associated not only with the organization of civilization, but with astronomy. The movement of stars, the order of planets, the timing of festivals, the structure of the calendar. They are, quite literally, the overseers of cosmic time. To the Babylonians, Nibiru, the crossing point, was both a celestial marker and an honorific name of Marduk, the king of gods. It was not a rogue planet. It was the coordinate that ensured order. But why did the ancients care so deeply about the crossing points of the heavens? Because something catastrophic had once come from the sky. Something that destroyed the world before theirs. The Anunnaki, then, symbolize more than divine authority. They symbolize the memory of forces, cosmic, environmental, or civilizational, that shaped humanity long before writing. This sets the stage for the next leap in our journey. We must now examine the moment when mythology and geology collide, when cosmic order fails, when fire descends, and when the world is forced into silence. Because if the Anunnaki represent the memory of the time before, then the Younger Dryas Cataclysm represents the moment the world ended. The myths tell the story as the flood. Science tells the story as ice, fire, and cometary ruin. Between them lies the truth, and that is where we go next. The sky will open, the oceans will rise, a civilization will be erased, and the survivors, whoever they were, will become gods in the eyes of those who come after. Prepare yourself. We have walked through clay tablets and royal epics. We have stood inside the walls of Uruk. We have followed Gilgamesh into darkness and listened to Utnapishtim recall the first apocalypse. We have traced the memory of the Anunnaki, those mythic shadows of an earlier world. Now we cross a threshold, because this next chapter does not begin with myth at all. It begins with fire. Every ancient civilization carries a story of the same nightmare. Not a metaphorical flood, not a moral allegory. A disaster so sudden, so violent, so unrelenting that the world before it was erased, not gradually, but completely. For thousands of years, scholars dismissed these stories as fantasy, folklore, imagination. Then, the earth itself began to speak. In 2007, a group of scientists proposed a radical idea: the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It suggested that Earth had been struck not by a single asteroid, but by a swarm of fragments from a disintegrating comet around 12,800 years ago. Not a single crater, no cinematic impact site. Instead, airbursts, shockwaves, firestorms. A chain reaction of destruction stretching across continents. And here is where science begins to sound uncannily like myth. The Younger Dryas event triggered a near-instant global temperature plunge, the collapse of ecosystems, the extinction of mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America, mega wildfires large enough to blacken the atmosphere. This is not speculation. It is written into the earth. A thin black layer, found across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, marks the exact moment the world changed. Inside it lie the fingerprints of cosmic catastrophe. Platinum spikes far above normal levels. Nanodiamonds formed only under extreme pressure and heat. Magnetic spherules, melted droplets of rock. Wildfire charcoal from forests that burned continent-wide. It is, essentially, the planet's own scar, a wound sealed beneath soil and time, the geological equivalent of the flood tablets. And it dates precisely to the moment humanity began again. So now we ask the question that archaeology has been reluctant to ask aloud. If the Earth has evidence of a cosmic cataclysm, if mythology across the world remembers a global flood, if a pre-existing culture was erased before Sumer rose, then are these stories not inventions, but memories? Let us follow the evidence, layer by layer. 1. The firestorm. Imagine standing anywhere in North America 12,800 years ago. The sky darkens, not with clouds, but with something shimmering. Fragments, thousands of them, exploding in the atmosphere with the force of nuclear blasts. Heat pulses sweep across the plains. Animals die instantly. Forests ignite. Smoke blackens the sun. Temperatures plummet. This is not a single disaster. It is dozens, all within hours. The Earth shifts from warming to freezing. Human populations collapse. Megafauna vanish. And in the aftermath, a world emerges unrecognizable. This description is not poetic. It is scientific reconstruction. And it mirrors, almost perfectly, the oldest flood myths, not in their symbolic water, but in their language of sudden annihilation. 2. The meltwater deluge. Now shift to the north, where the Laurentide ice sheet once sprawled across millions of square kilometers. When the impacts strike, massive sections of the ice melt instantly. This is not seasonal thaw. This is flash melt. The meltwater pours into rivers, into lakes, into oceans. It disrupts the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the planetary conveyor belt that regulates global climate. In a matter of years, the world plunges back into Ice Age conditions. Humanity, already scattered, is thrown into chaos. And here we arrive at something extraordinary: the Mesopotamian flood, the biblical flood, the Indian flood of Manu, the Greek flood of Deucalion, the Maya flood, the Australian Aboriginal flood, the Chinese flood of Gunyu, the Andean flood, the African flood traditions. Over 500 flood myths, all describing a sudden world-drowning disaster, all emerging from cultures separated by oceans, languages, and continental drift. Coincidence? Unlikely. Folklore refinement? Impossible. These stories did not evolve from one another. They erupted independently from the same trauma. 3. The cultural reboot. This is where archaeology and mythology converge. Something happened. Something global. Something devastating. After the Younger Dryas cataclysm, many human groups disappear from the record. Others, small, isolated, fragmented, rebuild over millennia. And then, suddenly, around 9500 to 5000 BCE, settlements appear with surprising sophistication. Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old. Jericho, 10,000 years old. Çatalhöyük, 9,500 years old. Mehrgar, 9,000 years old. These sites emerge not slowly but abruptly, as though guided by a memory or by people who had inherited fragments of something older. Stone circles, astronomical alignments, rituals, symbols. Not the inventions of novices, but the reconstructions of survivors. This is the part scholars cannot easily explain. How does monumental architecture appear immediately after a global catastrophe? How do hunter-gatherers suddenly build megalithic temples? How does agriculture erupt almost simultaneously in multiple regions? Unless they were not inventing, but remembering. 4. The people who lived through the end of the world. Imagine a world, an Ice Age world, with coastal cities now submerged under 120 meters of water after the melt. We would see only their ruins if we drained the oceans. But today, we see nothing. If a global cataclysm struck such a world, its survivors would be few. They would carry knowledge but lack resources. They would teach what they remembered, but not what they could no longer build. They would appear as gods to the tribes that followed, as culture bringers, as sages from a drowned world. In Sumer, they became the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged after the flood to restore civilization. In Egypt, they became the followers of Thoth, keepers of knowledge from a forgotten age. In Mesoamerica, they became Quetzalcoatl, the bearded bringer of science, mathematics, and order. In Greece, they became Prometheus, the fire bringer. In Polynesia, they became the luminous navigators who arrived after a great inundation. In India, the rishis, the divine seers, were said to walk the earth after a cosmic reset. These stories do not describe gods descending from heaven. They describe survivors rising from ruin. 5. The Echo in Sumer. And now we return to our central thread, the Sumerians. Their king list begins after the flood, but places a long lineage of rulers before it. Their tablets describe divine councils debating humanity, advanced knowledge given, stolen, or lost, a flood that erased an earlier epoch, sages who refounded civilization. Their myths are not creation stories. They are resurrection stories. Gilgamesh does not journey to understand the gods. He journeys to understand the catastrophe that shaped the world he inherited. The wall of Uruk, which he shows at the end of the epic, is more than a structure. It is the symbolic boundary between the world before the flood and the world after. 6. The scientific discomfort. Modern academia accepts the Younger Dryas event, but it avoids confronting the narrative implications. If a global cataclysm occurred, if it erased human populations, if survivors carried knowledge into the next age, then the origin of civilization cannot be a straight line. It must be a cycle. Rise, cataclysm, survival, transmission, rebirth. Sumer becomes not the beginning of human civilization, but the beginning of the second chapter. And the myths are the bridge between the two. 7. The terrifying possibility. We now reach the most unsettling conclusion. The flood myths do not warn about the past, they warn about the future. Because the cosmic cause of the Younger Dryas cataclysm did not end. Its source still exists. The Taurid meteor stream, a vast river of comet fragments, crosses Earth's orbit twice every year. Within it lies a dense cluster of large objects, and every few thousand years, Earth passes dangerously close to this swarm. The last time it happened, the sky burned, and human history began again. Some researchers believe the next close encounter is inevitable, a matter of when, not if. This is not prophecy. It is celestial mechanics. The ancients did not merely record the flood. They embedded it into ritual, into kingship, into myth, as a warning that the gods are not stable, that the heavens are not safe, that the cosmic order is temporary. 8. What comes next? We stand now at the precipice of a new understanding of human origins, one that does not dismiss myth as fantasy, nor inflate it into alien visitation, but recognizes it as the emotional and symbolic memory of a real planetary catastrophe. And yet, the story does not end here. Because after the Younger Dryas, after the flood myths, after the survival of human memory, another figure emerges. A scholar, a translator, a controversial visionary, one who took the Anunnaki myths and reframed them for the modern age, one who introduced Nibiru to millions of people, one who bridged the gap between ancient texts and modern conspiracy. His name is Zecharia Sitchin. And whether he was right or wrong, he changed the conversation forever. Before we explore the truth and the error of his claims, we must understand why his narrative caught fire, and what, buried beneath centuries of speculation, might still be real. Because behind his mistranslations and imaginative leaps lies a question the ancient tablets force us to ask. If the world ended once, how do we know it will not end again? That is the path ahead. Prepare yourself. Before we close this long descent into ancient memory, we must confront the figure who dragged the Anunnaki out of dusty academic circles and into the modern imagination. Zecharia Sitchin. A man who, depending on who you ask, was either a visionary who glimpsed a buried truth or an architect of one of the most influential misinterpretations in history. But here is the essential fact. He mattered because the world was ready for him. Sitchin did not create the hunger for alternative origins. He simply fed it. He stepped into a vacuum created by academia itself, a reluctance to address the gaps in human history, the anomalies that did not fit linear timelines, the myths that seemed too detailed to be fiction. And so, he gave millions a story. A story where gods were engineers, where tablets were technical manuals, where floods were orbital catastrophes, and where humans were the unintended offspring of cosmic miners. Most scholars rejected him. Many mocked him. But people listened to him. Why? Because Sitchin offered something academia rarely does. A narrative. A beginning, a conflict, a creator, a purpose, a catastrophe, and a destiny. In that sense, he was not competing with historians. He was competing with mythmakers. And mythmaking, whether in Sumer or on YouTube, is a powerful force. 1. Why Sitchin's vision spread. Sitchin's core idea was simple, almost cinematic. A distant world with a long elliptical orbit. A race of advanced beings in need of gold. A genetic experiment to create a worker species. A rebellion, a flood, and a new beginning. The details were flawed, often wildly so. He mistranslated. He overinterpreted. He forced connections the texts did not support. But he was tapping into something older, something embedded in the collective memory of humanity. The idea that knowledge was given, not invented. That the first kings were not mere men. That civilization rose too quickly to be accidental. That something came before Sumer. And in one sense, he was right. Not about alien miners or a rogue planet, but about this. Our history really does have a missing chapter. The Younger Dryas proved that civilizations, if they existed, would have been wiped clean. The flood myths proved something traumatic happened. The sudden rise of agriculture and architecture proved memory survived. So Sitchin was not wrong in his instinct, only in his interpretation. He reached for the stars when the answer was beneath the ice. 2. The real hidden architecture of human antiquity. Let us strip away the conjecture and examine what the data actually suggests. A global cataclysm occurred 12,800 years ago. It erased cultures, species, and landscapes. Human survivors carried memories forward through myth, ritual, symbols, and oral tradition. Civilization rose far too quickly after the catastrophe to be purely accidental. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed. Sumer appears with a complete writing system. Egypt appears with astronomical sophistication. The Indus Valley appears with engineered city grids. The Andes appear with stonework that defies explanation. There are fingerprints of a lost technical vocabulary in multiple cultures. Sumerian Meh, divine decrees, technologies. Egyptian Heka, ordered power. Vedic Vidya, sacred sciences. Maya Itz, creative force. The flood myths were not moral stories. They were survival manuals. They encode the timing, a sudden cosmic disaster. The effect, darkness, fire, drowning. The aftermath, rebuilding, knowledge transfer. Ancient kingships were justified by connection to the before. Every early dynasty ties itself to pre-flood rulers, sages, or gods. What emerges is not proof of aliens. It is proof of continuity, a relay of knowledge across a planetary collapse. Sitchin guessed the wrong civilization, but he sensed the right mystery. 3. The problem of amnesia. Why did Sumer open with kings who lived for thousands of years? Why did Egypt speak of a Zep Tepi, a first time before the pharaohs? Why do Andean myths insist the world was remade after a skyborne fire? Why does Plato's Atlantis story begin with the older civilization that fell into the sea? Why do Aboriginal Dreamtime stories describe an age before the fire wave? Because ancient people were not confused. They were remembering. Their ancestors saw the sky burn. They saw the world drown. They saw species die. They watched landscapes transform in a single lifetime. To dismiss these myths is to misunderstand what trauma does. Trauma does not articulate. It encodes. It wraps itself in symbol, in metaphor, in cosmology. So here is the truth. The Sumerian flood myth is not unique. It is part of a global archive of catastrophic memory. Sitchin mistook memory for mythology. He mistook symbolism for literalness. He mistook sages for astronauts. But he did not invent the mystery. He only misread it. 4. The most dangerous idea. Now we arrive at the most unsettling revelation of all. What if the ancients were not trying to explain their origins? What if they were trying to warn us about our future? The Younger Dryas event was not random. Earth passes through the torrid debris stream twice every year. Within that stream lies a dense cluster of massive fragments, some over a kilometer wide. If one of them intersects with Earth's trajectory, the result will not be localized. It will be continental or global. This is not fringe theory. Astronomers track these objects today. Some are still classified as potentially hazardous. Some are lost. Some will return. The ancients saw this. They lived it. They encoded it into myth so it would not be forgotten. But we forgot anyway. We built walls and cities like Uruk. We carved tablets and wrote histories. We built kingdoms, empires, and nations. But we did not solve the problem that ended the world last time. We merely survived it. Phi. The final layer. Consciousness and the inner ruins. Now we confront the most controversial theory, one not of astronomy or archaeology, but of mind. Some researchers suggest that the most important thing lost in the catastrophe was not technology, but consciousness. In myth after myth, the pre-flood world is described as clearer, closer to the gods, unified, more intuitive, less divided. After the flood, humanity becomes fearful, fragmented, forgetful, mortal in a new sense, limited. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is not a physical search, it is a metaphorical one. He is seeking what humanity once possessed, a state of awareness that transcended death. Not literal immortality, but continuity, integration, a mind that remembers without breaking. The flood shattered not only civilizations, but the psyche. It reset not just culture, but human consciousness. And if that is true, then the mystery of ancient history is not about aliens or gods, but about a human species that once operated at a different level of awareness, a level we barely understand, a level we have been trying to reassemble with science, myth, meditation, religion, astronomy, and philosophy. A level the ancients called Me, Heka, Vidya, Gnosis, Da'at, Its. These were not magical spells. They were the remnants of a forgotten cognitive technology. Sitchin mistook them for extraterrestrial devices, but they were human, deeply human. 6. The last question. So, after everything, the myths, the floods, the melted ice, the sages, the scribes, the comet fragments, the lost knowledge, the rebirth of civilization, we stand before one final question. What was the world before the flood really like? We cannot see it. The ocean swallowed most of it. The ice erased the rest. Time buried what remained. But we can infer certain things. It was older than we assumed. It was more advanced in certain ways, not with metal or machines, but with knowledge. It was destroyed suddenly. It left survivors who carried fragments of a forgotten blueprint. Sumer, Egypt, and others did not invent civilization. They inherited its ashes. And we, too, live downstream from that original firestorm. Which leads us to the final truth. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It is buried beneath our feet, encoded in our stories, preserved in our fear of the sky. 7. The closing of the circle. Let us return one last time to the beginning. We opened with a claim. There is a chapter of human history that has been violently erased. Now, at the end, we can refine it. There was not one chapter erased. There were many. We are the descendants of survivors. We remember in fragments, in symbols, in myths, in walls, in clay, in fear, in awe. The story of humanity is not linear. It is cyclical. It is catastrophic. It is resilient. Sitchin chased gods among the stars. The truth is more haunting. The gods were us. The builders were us. The witnesses were us. The survivors were us. And the next chapter, the one after Sumer, after Egypt, after our present age, will depend on whether we learn what they tried to preserve. 8. The final line. If you take nothing else from our long journey, let it be this. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is borrowed time, and the sky always comes to collect. If you've traveled this far, thank you. Tell me what part of this forgotten world you want to explore next. And until then, stay curious, stay awake, and remember, the past is never really gone. It waits for us, just beneath the ashes.